right. Hello, everyone. Oh, that's nice. My name is Linnea Anderson. On behalf of the First Fridays Committee in the Archives and Special Collections Department, welcome to First Fridays. This season's theme is Matters of the Heart. I agree. Today's presentations will also be posted later on the University of Minnesota Library's YouTube channel. First Fridays is a monthly series of presentations made possible by a generous gift from Governor Elmer L. Anderson and Mrs. Eleanor Anderson in honor of former library director, Dr. Edward B. Stanford. The presentations are based on materials in the University Library's archives and special collections. A special thank you to the interpreters from Middle English who will be providing ASL interpretation for today's talks. If time allows, we will have questions and answer at the end. Zoom audience members, if you have any questions for our speaker today, please submit them using the Q&A function and not the chat so that we can keep track of your questions. In-person audience, please hold your questions until the end. There will be a tour after the presentations with Aaron. At this point, we will pause for a land acknowledgement. The University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen relations with tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for Native American students, staff, faculty, and community members. So our presentations today feature the University of Minnesota Archives and the Tretter Collection in GLBT Studies. And our first presentation is How Can You Mend a Broken Heart? A Brief History of Heart and Cardiovascular Research at the University of Minnesota by Erik Moore, University Archivist. Heart disease became a leading cause of death in the mid-20th century. In response, researchers at the University of Minnesota contributed to combating the epidemic through physiological, epidemiological, and nutritional research, and by developing community campaigns to educate the public about heart health. Their efforts were not without detractors who challenged the science and sought to discredit the research. Today's presentation will provide a brief history and connect this work to current public health efforts.
Good afternoon. My name is, thank you. My name is Erik Moore. I'm the University Archivist and Director for the University Digital Conservancy. Our topic today is the history of cardiovascular disease research and how it has shaped our world. I should begin with an apology to the researchers I will introduce you to today. They would be the first to correct me that their efforts were never to mend a broken heart, but rather to keep it from injury in the first place. Apologies also to the Bee Gees for co-opting their song title into a hook to draw you in today and perhaps an earworm you can leave with. Nearly 5 years ago, on March 31st, 2020, Doctors Deborah Birx and Anthony Fauci delivered a stark assessment in a televised White House news conference that in best case scenario, only 100 to 240,000 Americans would die from COVID-19. Of course, we would later know that nearly 385,000 Americans died by the end of 2020. This news conference followed the previous 2 weeks of school closures, work from home orders, social distancing that fundamentally upended our modern life. The realities of this public health emergency changed public policy, affected social interactions, and interjected disbelief in some to the validity of the science presented. It would not be the first time television introduced public health crisis to the American public. Nearly 70 years prior, in 1953, CBS television aired The Search, a featured program focused on the root cause of heart disease and efforts to combat its growing prevalence in American society. The program opens with journalist and U of M alum Erik likening heart disease to a murderer, and the researchers at the University of Minnesota's Laboratory of Physiological Hygiene as investigative detectives. In a dramatic scene, Dr. Keyes, director of the laboratory, randomly tips over 5 out of 10 wooden blocks, like chess pieces on a board, to demonstrate the percentage of American adults who will succumb to cardiovascular disease without warning.
The facts are simple. You know the chief killer of Americans is cardiovascular disease, disorders and degeneration of the heart and blood vessels. Here are vital statistics. They show that this problem here in America is the worst in the world. It's not merely a problem of old people. The death rate among comparatively young men is shocking. It's not a reflection on our doctors or hospitals. Probably our mode of life and our diet are involved. But the trouble is, we just don't know enough about it. It strikes without warning. Of 10 men, we can expect 5 to get it. But we can't say who, or when, or why.
Yet cardiovascular disease was not always such a prominent condition. At the beginning of the 20th century, infectious diseases like influenza and tuberculosis were the primary causes of death in the United States. As public health and sanitation measures curbed infectious diseases, heart disease became the primary cause of death. In response to the sharp rise in cases, President Truman signed the National Heart Act in 1948, establishing today's National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute within the NIH. Epidemiological investigations into the epidemic began in the late 1940s, including the well-known longitudinal Framingham Heart Study. Yet it was a different president who captured the public's attention with heart disease. In 1955, news of President Eisenhower's heart attack shocked the nation. In the aftermath, the American public learned what many researchers were coming to believe were primary contributors and risk factors for heart disease, namely diet, alcohol, tobacco use, exercise, and family history. Heart disease peaked in the United States during the 1960s with an estimated 466 deaths out of 100,000 people. During the following 50 years, incidences decreased dramatically. In 2020, cardiovascular disease was at 1/4 from its peak. However, it remains the #1 cause of death, more than all forms of cancer and lower respiratory disease combined. Ansel Keys is known for several significant research projects that are part of the American cultural lexicon. As part of an early war effort, Keys developed the nutrient-rich meal pack for soldiers to carry, known as the K ration. And here's a picture from field testing. In 1959, Keys co-authored with his wife, Margaret Keys, the book Eat Well, Stay Well, which popularized the Mediterranean diet and introduced the American public to the science behind the diet. The popularity of the book landed Keyes and his research on the cover of Time magazine in 1961. And in 1972, Keyes modernized the 19th century size ratio tool to standardize human subject measurements and coined the new instrument Body Mass Index, or BMI, a number we all wish to forget. Yet it is likely Keyes' direction of the Minnesota semi-starvation experiment in 1944 for which he is often associated. The study, contracted with the U.S. Office of Scientific Research and Development, recruited 36 conscientious objectors through the civilian public service for a controlled experiment in which Keyes and his fellow researchers subjected the volunteers' bodies to the effects of starvation, recorded the physiological and psychological consequences, and then documented the rehabilitation process. The results included the 2-volume Biology of Human Starvation, published in 1950 by the University of Minnesota Press, and an aid worker manual titled Men and Hunger, focused on the physiological effects and behavior patterns of those who experience starvation. In 1946, when discussing the results of the starvation experiment and how to apply proposed rehabilitation efforts to large portions of post-war European populations, Keyes famously declared, "Starved people cannot be taught democracy," thus introducing nutritional physiology as a new front in the early days of the Cold War. Through his continued research into population physiology, Keyes identified a paradox in the rates of heart disease in different populations. He found that wealthy countries with access to abundant foods, including fruits and vegetables, had higher mortality than those with limited or unstable food supplies, as was the case in post-war Europe. For nearly 3 decades, Keyes' laboratory continued this research, producing the seminal 7-country study, which scrutinized the relationships between diet, cholesterol, and cardiovascular disease across an international cohort of 20,000 individuals. Complementing the Framingham Heart Study, the 7-country study demonstrated the causality of risk factors at the population level, rather than the individual or community. The results indicated that smoking, diets high in saturated fat, and blood cholesterol accounted for much of the variation in heart disease prevalence across populations, a revelation that is now so ingrained in modern medical practice, public health policy, and American popular culture, that recognizing the social and cultural behaviors had not just an impact on individual health, but on the health of the entire population, resulted in a democratizing effect for the role of public health in society. Communities could now set the norms for their behaviors and could affect the prevalence of cancer and cardiovascular disease across populations. The photograph on the screen is of Ushibiki, Japan, one of the sites for the 7-country study, taken by Ansel Keys. Several of Keyes' peers and next-generation researchers in public health further contributed to examining the risk factors for cardiovascular disease and participated in public-facing investigations and interventions to reduce death and morbidity. Dr. Leonard Schumann arrived at the University of Minnesota in 1954 and served as the first director for the Division of Epidemiology in the School of Public Health. During his tenure, Schumann oversaw a rapidly changing and developing field of epidemiology, from the original polio vaccine trials to the development of early detection for colon cancer. Notably, Schumann served as on the influential Surgeon General's Advisory Committee that published the 1964 report, Smoking and Health. The report was a meta-study of thousands of data points establishing the causality between smoking and several diseases, including lung cancer and heart disease. The report's release had an almost immediate impact on the sales of cigarettes, and the findings correlate with a decrease in smoking rates and subsequent reduction in heart disease to present day. While the report does focus on the relation between smoking and heart disease, it is the report's findings on the causation of smoking and lung cancer that most think of. Schumann was the primary author for this chapter, and his initial handwritten draft is found in our papers in the archives. At least we think that our understanding of the dangers of diet, cholesterol, and smoking were all self-evident to these researchers. On page 4 of his draft is an accidental cigarette burn. Reveals one of the greatest ironies and a story in itself. Schumann was known as a heavy smoker, which was likely one of the reasons he was included as a member in the advisory committee to illustrate the committee's non-bias to the tobacco industry. Dr. Henry Blackburn, initially a program officer in the 7-country study, and later Key's successor in the Laboratory for Physiological Hygiene, and then Schumann's for the position of chair of the department or division of epidemiology. Continued cardiovascular research in the School of Public Health. Following 7 countries, Blackburn developed the multiple risk factor intervention trial, MRFIT, MRFIT, or sometimes unfortunately known as Mr. Fit. It was a nationwide program studying the populations at reducing heart attack risks in middle-aged men through lifestyle changes. Modeled on earlier population studies and leveraging the field of biostatistics, it was one of the largest multi-center clinical trials ever conducted, with over 12,000 participants. In the 1980s, Blackburn continued to develop population surveys and community education, including the Minnesota Heart Survey and the Minnesota Heart Health Program. The cross-sectional data collected from over 25,000 men and women in door-to-door surveys, physical exams, and data on morbidity and mortality provided an immense amount of documentation for heart disease. The results showed fewer people dying of heart disease than prior decades, demonstrating that such deaths are largely preventable if interventions and societal changes are implemented. Societal change, of course, is not easy, and research focused on causation will have its opponents. Naysayers ranged from lay individuals who took the time to write in with their opinions, like this postcard to Schumann, suggesting that perhaps it wasn't cigarettes that caused lung cancer, but the inhaling of butane from cigarette lighters. They suggested that when everyone used matches, the rates of the disease were much lower, and that Schumann might be on the wrong track. It also included serious debates among academic and medical researchers on whether or not observational data could be used to prove dietary intake caused heart disease. But it is likely the pushback from the food industry that sustained the attack and continued to sow seeds of doubt into the research. After that 1959 publication of Eat Well, Stay Well, Ansel and Margaret Keyes received a fair amount of attention in the press, and the book became a popular bestseller on the New York Times list. News articles and reviews were quick to highlight what many perceived to be the book's anti-meat messaging, leading those in the meat industry to be critical of the authors and their science. The trade magazine, Food and News Nutrition, published by the National Meat and Livestock Board, reviewed the book and took the recommendations to task and sought to undermine Keyes' authority. Keyes wrote back with a paragraph-by-paragraph rebuttal, ending with, presumably Food and Nutrition News would prefer that its commercial and self-interest not be so too blatant, but your bias is showing. He then referenced an editorial from the East Grand Forks Record that advised him to stay clear of the Red River Valley, lest he be embarrassed by the kisses of the populace due to their joy of his support of potatoes, wheat, beans, and peas, all staples to the local farming community. In 1973, the American Heart Association raised a complaint with the Federal Trade Commission on a statement put forward by the National Commission on Egg Nutrition and a commercial industry group. The Egg Commission claimed there is absolutely no scientific evidence whatsoever that eating eggs in any way increases the risk of heart attack. The FTC filed suit, and Henry Blackburn served as an expert witness. The egg lobbyists fired back, declaring the guns are booming in the cholesterol war, and an early injunction allowed the egg industry to continue their claims and be identified, and they identified Dr. Blackburn as one of their targets in a trade magazine. However, in the end, Dr. Blackburn withstood their attacks and demonstrated the difference between dietary cholesterol and intake and serum cholesterol. The Egg Commission lost their case, dropped their stance, and that's your serum levels there, dropped their stance and fought back in what would be one of the most successful ad campaigns of the 20th century, the incredible edible egg, which many of you might also know the jingle to that as well. There are many others at the University of Minnesota who contributed to research and prevention of heart disease, including Henry Taylor, Arthur Leon, Henry Buchwald, and just to name a few. And their stories and research are also found in the University of Minnesota archives. The significance of the history of cardiovascular disease prevention highlights the change in the 20th century's public health from a field focusing on infectious diseases and surveillance to identifying social and behavioral risk factors at the population level to prevent disease. This change affected not only how public health is studied, but also how those studies are funded, primarily by the federal government, and communicated to the world through mass media campaigns. These efforts introduced public policy into the equation and implemented educational programs that forever altered the way Americans and the world understand health risks and prevention. As subsequent public health issues arose, such as HIV/AIDS, obesity, gun violence, and even COVID-19, the emphasis on moderating population risk factors and community health education as a prevention method is tied directly to the lessons learned from the cardiovascular disease epidemic and the researchers at the University of Minnesota. Thank you.
Thanks, Erik. Our second presentation is An Underdog and a Good Friend, the Vivian Vance Memorial Card Collective, and the Love of Queer Friendship by Aidan Bettine, curator of the Tretter Collection in GLBT Studies. Aidan's presentation will showcase a nearly 50-year running friendship, evidencing the lasting bonds of queer friend groups.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here today and to be able to perhaps shift the way some of our First Fridays talks have gone and maybe literally queer it as the queer archivist, queer and trans archivist here at the helm of the Tretter Collection. And part of this is because when I first signed up for this talk, we schedule these months and months in advance in the summer before the academic calendar year, pick a theme, matters of the heart, and decide who wants to speak from their various collections. And I'm thankful that going alongside Erik will put us in not so stark juxtaposition, but certainly differing in terms of what our collections hold, how we present it, and how we're able to talk about it, which I think is part of the queerness that I'm offering here. I also couldn't have predicted, to some extent, where we'd be in our political landscape in 2025. And the attacks specifically on LGBTQ people, our history, our existence, and our livelihoods happening right now. And so because of that, I wanted to shift what could have been an academic presentation on friendship to one that is a personal presentation on friendship and historical visibility of LGBTQ elders, ancestors, and friends. One that is certainly not just a matter of the heart to many LGBTQ people, but also to myself. So I get to place myself in this narrative. Perfect. I wanted to provide some context, standing from the Tretter Collection and talking about the necessity of LGBTQ visibility historically. Most LGBTQ archives to this day are still held in community, run by volunteers, funded by grants, and done as an act of service and love for the community. During the gay liberation era, when community archives first started to spring up, they quickly began to travel slideshows. Ooh, go this way. I'll click it. There we go. Showing images of LGBTQ life and representation. These slideshows varied from intimate settings inside of personal homes, living rooms, across coffee tables, to more formal academic presentations and kind of pseudo-queer academic conferences and other spaces that would let LGBTQ people actually speak, talk to each other, and show a vast history. A number of the flyers on the screen are an array of those early slideshows from throughout the 1970s and 1980s, ranging from the photographs to the more academic talks. These shows often traveled. They were bookable, billable around the country with community archivists, historians from the LGBTQ community sharing our history widely with each other. These slideshows were actually very rarely for straight audiences. So much so that Will Roscoe, a community historian in 1992, or an academic historian from the community in 1992, wrote, quote, "The slide lecture is the hallmark of community-based lesbian and gay history. Taking advantage of a time-honored, low-tech medium, the typical presentation combines running narrative with the programmed use of slides. Recorded music and other enhancements are easily added. The results can approximate the dramatic and visuals of filmed documentary. Indeed, the use of images in this way enacts a core metaphor of gay liberation, the shattering of invisibility," end quote. And so today, in terms of matters of the heart, I'd like to shatter the invisibility of the queer community and friendship bonds and relationships that sustain time. As a community, we often find each other first, or find ourselves first, coming to terms with our identities, looking for others, finding our friends, and building a community that can survive and thrive together. And I wanted to show you one that is near and dear to my heart, the Vivian Vance Memorial Card Collective. It all starts with this man who is also in this room, Craig Esbeck. Here he is photographed in the basement of what was the initial building of the LGBTQ Iowa Archives and Library, a community archives and library in Iowa City, Iowa, that I founded in 2020. Craig's reading a book in our old library set up there. Craig, who was born in Iowa and moved to Minneapolis in 1975, has spent decades traveling the globe from Vermont to Uganda and living abroad, but has stayed tethered and tied to his friends in the Vivian Vance Memorial Card Collective. When he returned to Iowa and needed to offload some of his materials that had long been in storage at his brother's house, he found the LGBTQ Iowa Archives and Library at the suggestion that someone, or from someone, that I would be very interested in his papers. I believe Craig doubted that, and I've fortunately proved him wrong over time. In Craig's papers, beyond recognizing his larger life and travels nonprofit work around literacy in Uganda, he also had remnants and vestiges of this friend group, the VVMCC. And I remember the first time I learned about it, feeling so astonished that people had remained friends across time, across dating, across other relationships that often can interrupt queer bonds and friendships. But they had sustained, and Craig was still a member and a longtime friend. Here's Craig with some of his archives, which includes some letters, and I'll draw your eyes to a cassette tape that you'll hear from towards the end of this presentation on the table. And there's us together learning about Craig's history and this friend group. Because of Craig, I also had the fortunate opportunity, well before my time here in Tretter, to meet all the VVMCC members that May in 2021 after he donated his papers on a trip up to Northfield, Minnesota, where they were gathering, pictured here, some folks you will see in the audience. What is amazing is to see queer elders, and I don't mean that offensively to my friends in the room. What I mean is it's incredible to see LGBTQ people with gray hair. LGBTQ people who have sustained lives and relationships together healthily, happily, and in community and camaraderie. People that I know have done incredible organizing throughout our community here in Minnesota and still do that work today. And people that I'm proud to call my friends. So I was there, but of course I was taking this photo. And I think they have the photos with me in the photo. So just picture me in the background. Meeting all these elders and how incredible that was. But I want to talk about how we actually got to the Vivian Vance Memorial Card Collective. How did we move from this iconic photo that they feature on their mugs, t-shirts, and other swag related to VVMCC, such as this, to a friend group? In the 1970s, mid-1970s, in the neighborhood here in Minneapolis in Loring Park, a group of friends gathered and began to play cards, games, have dinner parties, weekly bowling, dancing, camping trips, picnics, and lavish parties together. They spent many holidays together as friends. Originally just a card group, a card collective, it took until 1980 for them to find perhaps the bounding definition, their name, the VVMCC. 1980 was the year after Vivian Vance, the actress who played Ethel Mertz in I Love Lucy, passed away. Ethel Mertz was the middle-aged landlady of the main character on I Love Lucy, Lucy Ball, of course played by Lucille Bell. The two female characters were close friends. They were habitually scheming together. Ethel was generally the voice of reason, and as a counterpart, and often served as a counterpart to Lucy's harebrained ideas and schemes. I Love Lucy aired on CBS from October 15th, 1951 to May 6th, 1957, with a total of 180 half-hour episodes spanning 6 seasons. I Love Lucy became the most watched show in the United States in 4 of its 6 seasons. And the friendship with Lucy and Ethel, or between Lucy and Ethel, was certainly a core piece of that storyline. For VVMCC, the reason they chose Ethel, or Vivian, as the main featured character and namesake was because they wanted someone who represented close friendship, somebody who was often second fiddle or the underdog, but was known as purely a good friend. So coming full circle, then, after moving up to Minneapolis to take on the Tretter Collection position, and here's a photo of Craig holding an image of VVMCC members marching in a Twin Cities Pride Parade down in Iowa, the photo. I was able to build a relationship and collect the records of VVMCC, which is something that I honestly think many archivists might steer away from. A scrapbook of friends, right? A coffee cup. This one's my copy, not the archives copy, that has water in it, and some t-shirts, right? We'd like to stray away, and of course, a deck of cards. But as archivists, we like to stray away from collecting objects often, and we also sometimes want more significant, quote unquote, significant or critical history to come into our fold. And I think it's really important that I get to archive this friend group. We had to give you a laugh and an image. There we go. All right. I was probably supposed to click through that slide, but that's all right. There we go. Vivian Vance. See, she's here with us. Okay. My bad. There we go. One of my favorite things about Vivian Vance and Lucy is that there were also rumors about them being lovers. So I think whether it was queerly intentional or not, I think it was, this is a great friend to choose for the name of the group. I'm going to show you some of those tabloids from the 1970s. Lucy and I adored each other. Then people began to whisper that we were lesbian lovers. A queer friend indeed. But unlike, or I should say absolutely like many friends, what Vivian Vance Memorial Card Collective did throughout time was sustain events, engagement, both in public and in private. They hosted annual yard sales that were quite large on Lyndale and Garfield, in the Lyndale neighborhood, I should say, on Garfield, drew a great crowd and had people swapping their goods and wares. You can see the VVMCC t-shirts on many of the members here in the room. Historically, I don't know that you're wearing your t-shirts today. I love this ad, out of the closet sale, right? And the reality that something like VVMCC could decide, a group like VVMCC could decide to fly under the radar and be read as unqueer in some spaces, but the fact that I think all of you have been boldly LGBT or LG in front of so many people, consistently sharing your name and your pride and your friendship. They were friends who camped, meeting outside, sharing campfires, playing games, setting up tents in the dark. These friendships don't look unlike ones that you all might know in your own communities and with your own relationships. But again, I stress the importance here is the visibility and the ability to see queer friendship, queer life on screen in the archive, available to many. The laughter's coming from the group as I show their photos. Okay. Thanks, Kate. One of my favorite parts of EVMCC, learning about their history, was also their themed parties. Here we have the 1979 party about the Skylab disaster, where parts of the space station fell into the Indian Ocean and the Australian Ocean. So why not celebrate it and decorate yourself as part of the disaster? No one was harmed in that disaster. The astronauts were not on the Skylab. It's like an earlier iteration of the International Space Station. In the 90s, VVMCC started to march in Twin Cities pride parades. 1992 was the first parade where they marched, visibly celebrating their friendship in the streets of Minneapolis. They also tabled at the 1994 Twin Cities Pride in Loring Park, representing both their namesake and that history, certainly the campiness of LGBTQ life and friends. I think there's one more. They were too good. I had to show you all the Pride ones. But much like family, and I can't undergird or stress enough that LGBTQ people are often operating in communities and networks of chosen family. These are the people we build our homes with, we spend our lives with, and therefore we spend our holidays with. One of my favorite traditions looking through the VVMCC scrapbook was around Easter, a holiday some people might not think a lot of LGBTQ people participate in. But here we have picnics, egg tosses, the annual egg toss, always with some disasters, to Easter egg hunts and costumes. My favorite Easter tradition is pin the plate on the Last Supper, where you can clearly see one member of, at a time is blindfolded and meant to stick a plate on this 3D wooden cutout of the Last Supper. I'm sure there must have been a prize for whoever was the most successful with placing a plate on the table. They also celebrated Halloween, annual pumpkin carving contests. I find it appropriate that it's Bert and Ernie, good friends. Thanksgiving, including long drawn-out pageants, and Christmas, a holiday that can often feel so empty and lonely when you don't find yourself potentially with your biological family, right? There's friends afar and wide in VVMCC. I want to play that cassette tape that I mentioned to all of you at the front. That was a 1981 letter to Craig from Elaine. Both are in this room, so I'm sorry, Elaine, that you get to hear your voice today. 44 years ago. But it's a sign of friendship, and I think it's one of the most meaningful things I've ever listened to in the archive. And I wanted to share it with you, if it'll play.
D, E, C, period, 8, comma, 1981. In the year of our Lord, the first anniversary that John Lennon was murdered. Dearest Craig Pooh, I would like to take a moment out of my busy holiday schedule to write you this petite plea from moi. That's M-O-I, I think. And all your close VVMCC members, friends. Period. Dearest Craig Pooh, it feels like forever since I last saw you there in Vermont. So, here comes the plea. Hold on to your cookies. New paragraph. First of all, Craig Pooh, darling, you know our Christmas will be so vacant without you. It's been that it would feel vacant without you. I already said that. I'll say it again. How can we be expected to endure one Christmas without you? Craig Pooh makes a little rhyme. I hear the Greyhound prices are real good this holiday season. And such a lovely time to travel. Just think of all the interesting people you'd meet on your somewhat tedious, yet, capital yet, very enjoyable ride. And remember, once you get here, all your little worries are over. Just remember, room and board free, capital F-R-E-E. All in exchange for just a few short hours of heavy house cleaning. know if these pleas haven't gotten to you yet. Here comes the clincher. Craig Pooh, from all your very dear and close friends here in Minneapolis, we send this out to you with all of our love for the holidays.
Oh, there's no place like home for the holidays.
There's more if you want to hear more of that tape some other time. But Elaine, I love that message to Craig and the connection to family and the notion of home. The way that we call each other, organize each other, and stay tethered throughout time and space. And it's a tremendous honor to be an honorary member of the VVMCC today. I never expected when I went to meet everyone for the first time in May of 2021 that I would first recommend they archive their history at the Tretter Collection, and that second, I would be the one who got to do that. Serendipitous for sure. What VVMCC teaches me, teaches other LGBTQ members, especially youth, is the ability to center each other, sustain our lives together, and remain tethered even through harder and challenging political climates. The VVMCCers have seen the AIDS epidemic come and change. They've certainly lived through the COVID-19 pandemic, as Erik mentioned. And on top of that, I can't think of the countless fights for LGBTQ rights, freedom, visibility, marriage equality, and different forms of inclusion that have happened over the last 50-some years in our history. What amazes me is that a little over 50 years ago, this friend group started and has sustained through all of this, through all of the change, but they immediately found each other as they were finding themselves in the 1970s. Mid-1970s, the lore around when they started was often a challenging time for people to even be out. It's the height of the gay liberation movement, amid protests, amid riots, amid different acts of violence and acts of community gathering at the same time. And so it's amazing to be able to see friendships made and sustained and to become a part of that legacy. I share this today not only as a matter of my heart, but to exemplify the way that the Tretter Collection contains a history of community care, of community relationships, and the deeply affective, personal, and emotional archives around the LGBTQ community. It's a hallmark of what we do. We don't just save the stories of heroes, famous people, politicians, etc., although we do that. We love to share the history of the mundane, daily, queer life, where you can see people existing, thriving, celebrating, and finding joy in community. So much of the history and conversation that we do get around LGBTQ pasts often talks about the hardship, the heartbreak, the activism, the epidemic, and other big impacts on the community. And so as I move through the future in 2025, I think heavily about my role at the helm of Tretter to maintain intergenerational memory around queer history, to share the relationships that we have, the history that we've overcome, and give reminders to younger LGBTQ people. I pull out this scrapbook for classes quite often now that it's in my possession, among other evidence of LGBTQ people photographed throughout time. Most recently, it was with a group of middle schoolers from two gender and sexuality alliances in Minneapolis public schools. And I kid you not, all of those youth are surprised to see any queer history from before the year 2000. let alone to know that queer and trans people have aged gracefully in community together. So to Val, Craig, Jack, Paul, who's no longer with us, Elaine, Donald, Dale, Elizabeth, Kate, and Darcy, I say thank you for teaching me and giving me the opportunity to share with others what the power of queer friendship looks like, especially sustaining across time and place, as I know not all of you live right here in Minneapolis anymore. So thank you.
Okay, we have time for maybe one or two questions. Do we have anything from the online audience? Okay. In-person audience, does anyone have a question for one of our presenters? Oh, back here. Hi. Oh, we'll get you a microphone. Just 1 second there. That way we can get it on. Thanks, Sandy. It'll pick up the system. Yeah, we're archivists. We
Thank
need to
you.
document.
Okay.
Yes.
Hi. I didn't hear that. Now everybody's laughing. Thank you. This is a heart question. I realize at first so much of the study was men. When did they switch to and or include women? Thank you.
So I don't have exact numbers in front of me or dates. The Minnesota Heart Health Program, beginning in 1980 or 1983, was both men and women for sure. But you are correct, and they even discuss it in the some of the work about the like one of the first studies was actually businessmen, right? It was specifically focused on a particular economic class as well, not just men. Yeah, that's right. Which was a difficult for study for them to conclude because they didn't have a large enough data set. So yeah, teaches you something too. Yeah.
Any other? Oh, here's one over here. Thanks, Sandy.
Just a couple of things. If I'm not mistaken, Keyes practiced what he preached and continued to do research until he was around 100 years old, which says something. But I have a question for you. I think late in his career, Keyes wrote a book called The Benevolent Bean. I wonder if that was a response to the edible egg.
Quite possibly. But yes, he lived to be over 100 years old, and you know, he originally his PhD is actually in fish physiology. He wasn't didn't begin in human physiology at first, so it's quite a career trajectory.
Got a question from online, and this one's for Aiden. Jane is asking, how does marriage equality affect friendship groups? Have you seen that play out in the archives at all?
Have I seen marriage equality play out in the archives? Absolutely. Thinking about friendship groups, I would say the biggest thing that we evidence in Tretter around that is the ways that LGBTQ people have still held commitment ceremonies and maybe legally unrecognized marriages and unions throughout time. Marriage is not new. Marriage equality is not new. In terms of legal legislation, sure, it's different and newer and now recognized since, what, 2012? But I think we have a plethora of evidence of the ways that communities of friends come together to celebrate their loved ones and recognize those marriages through commitment ceremonies and other forms of commemoration and celebration together. So I think that's how I would say it's evidenced. Friends show up for each other. to celebrate unions that maybe aren't so traditional, that are at risk, that are legally unrecognized throughout many decades of U.S. history and open queer life. Most notably, I'll have to say we have Jack Baker and Michael McConnell's papers, the first men who tried to legally marry in the United States in 1971. And I would say in a more specific example, through the public response to their attempt at marriage and becoming known as, quote, the homosexual couple, just one, right? That they gained friends and relationships and people to organize with through everybody who wrote to them and reached out and said, hey, I'm also looking for a boyfriend. How did you find one? I'm going to find myself in Minneapolis, or I'm moving to Minneapolis because I saw you on television and you're able to live your life in Minneapolis. And so I think in that tangible case, Tretter documents the way a public attempt at marriage builds relationships, friendships, and community.
Thanks so much to both of the speakers. This gets back to your question. I just wanted to say that it really wasn't until the 1990s that the disparities in research findings in women's health for heart disease versus men's, that's when it started to be openly recognized. And there was a push to get more funding to research women's heart outcomes. And if you stop and think of the way the National Institute of Health is organized, we have we have the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute for studying heart disease. We have nothing about women's health. If we have questions about women's health research, we have to go through the Children's Health organization. So there are some built-in inequalities. For heart disease, we need to go through NHLBI and make sure that research is divided equally.
Everybody, thank you for the really interesting questions. Thanks again to the presenters and the interpreters. We have a few announcements, so sit tight.